How important is the Ganga to India's future? In this session, journalist Victor Mallet, Asia News editor for the Financial Times, discusses his book, A River Runs Through It, with Suhasini Haidar, the Hindu's diplomatic editor. We'll just get started in a couple of minutes.
Good morning, all, and thank you for joining us today. I see that through either Freudian slip or perhaps without meaning to, there's a typo in the name of the book that we are going to discuss. And it is the truth. The Ganga does in several parts. So where it says a river runs trough, it should really, of course, be a river runs through it. But this is an important book. This is an important book to be read, not just as many think. You know, when a foreign correspondent, excuse me, Victor, but when a foreign correspondent writes a book about India, one tends to see it as their experience of India. And there have been amazing foreign correspondent memoirs, including Victor's. You know, Mark Tully. Every time we put Mark Tully on a stage, the audience definitely reacts and engages with his idea of India. But this is not just an important book because it is a story of India, as Victor says, or an idea of India. This is an important work because it tells you, like very few other works have, exactly what's going on when it comes to India's lifeline, when it comes to India's sacred thread, as it is called, and that is the Ganga. In many ways, and you will, when you read the book, see what I mean, the book is an offense to every sense. And I see Victor sort of cringing a bit with the word, but it's true, because as you read the book, you begin to see the Ganga not just as the pure joy its name evokes, or the idea we all have of a beautiful river which is pure to drink in the higher reaches of the mountains, but you begin to smell it, to even taste it, to sense what it's like to be swimming in a river with perhaps some part of a corpse floating by next to you. So there is an offense, there is a sense of offense which we should all feel, particularly as Indians, that this is the state of this river, which the book says again and again, you know, is possibly the world's most worshipped river and possibly the world's most polluted river. The book itself spans both history and geography. So, you know, different people would, I'm sure, organize their thoughts in different ways. Some would do it just purely by going, Victor does it, going from Gormukh and going all the way to the Bay of Bengal. But Victor goes between as well and takes you through the history of some of those parts. He takes you through the connections in South Asia in particular, but also in Chiltern, I think, where he finds a well which has a connection to Ganga. I'm not going to give the entire book away. But they're in Sri Lanka, you know, southernmost tip of India and beyond. There is a temple named after the Ganga. And he takes you through its origins in our holy texts, in the Mahabharata and in the Ramayana, and weaves it in as he is himself taking this journey down the river. Victor, I would like to start by asking you, as you've known so many foreign correspondents who do come to India, many of them do go away with a book. They do go away with writing a book about India. You could have chosen a lot of subjects. Why this one?
You're right. I mean, one of the great things about India, if you work here as a journalist, is that it's so rich in stories of all kinds. So whether you're writing a book or writing for a newspaper, you go to any village or any town and people talk to you. And that's one of the things I love about India. But there is so much to say, so much to write about, so much to research that you have to, in a sense, pick some kind of thread around which you can weave a particular story. And I chose the river because I think I've always loved rivers, and rivers are very important to all civilizations. And the Ganga, I argue, is probably the world's most important river because not only because it's holy to 1 billion Hindus, but because it supports the largest population on Earth of any river. I mean, a tenth of the world's population is more or less directly dependent
Both
on
India and Bangladesh.
India and Bangladesh, and even parts of Nepal as well. So it is a hugely important river, not just spiritually, but also economically, socially, and in every other way. So I just thought it was a nice way of describing, what's wrong with India and what's right with India, because of course there are many. It's a lament for the river and the state of the river, the pollution, and so on. But it's also a celebration of the river and its history and its sort of immense cultural accretions, these great civilizations that have risen and fallen on the banks of the river. So I've tried to be, realistic about the problems and the contemporary problems that face the river. But I also, I love the river, and I've bathed in it many times, which a lot of people, when they've read the book, they said, "You swam in it?" But yes, and so do many Indians, of course. Not in Allahabad at the Kumbh Mela, also upstream in Rishikesh and so on. So it's an exciting thing to write about, and it's a good way of describing, the wonderful aspects of Indian life, and also the problematic aspects which this government, the Modi government, and other governments essentially need to resolve.
All right. You also came here at an interesting time of churn, if I may say so, in Indian politics, and somehow the Ganga wove itself into the elections, not just because Prime Minister Modi chose Varanasi as his constituency, but then went on in his first Independence Day address to discuss the other untalked about issue that essentially affects the Ganga the most, the fact that not enough people have access to toilets or use them. My question is really, in the years that it took you to write this book, to cover the stories that go into this book, how much actually has changed for the better or for the worse for the Ganga?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think it's really important to remember this 2014 speech. This was the first speech that Modi gave, Independence Day speech, August 2014. He stood on the walls of the Red Fort, and all his enemies and critics, many of whom there are many in India, were worried that he was going to talk a Hindu fundamentalist message, he was going to be very old school BJP, but instead he said, "I'm going to stand here and talk to you about toilets, and I'm going to talk to you as well about women's rights." And a lot of people were amazed by this, because they thought, well, okay, this is really interesting. This is not like Trump's inaugural address. This is like somebody who maybe we can deal with and we'll get things done. And as you say, he stood in Benares, in Varanasi, on the banks of the Ganga, and he said, "Ma Ganga is screaming for help, and I have been called by God. I feel I have been called by God." Not by the BJP, he said, by God, to save the river. So then, 3 years on, 3.5 years on now, we look at this and we say, so did the government achieve all the things that it set out to do, that it said it would do? And unfortunately, and I wish I didn't have to say this, but I feel that actually surprisingly little has been achieved, given the amount of talk there was about helping the river and about tackling the pollution and so on. So the current situation is that actually there are plans afoot and some things have been done, but very, very little, given the amount of money that has been allocated and given the amount of government time. Now, this is not unique to the BJP government. Successive governments since Rajiv Gandhi's time, since the 1980s, they've had Ganga action plans, GAP 1, GAP 2, you've heard Yamuna action plan, YAP 1, YAP 2, YAP 3, funded by the Japanese. This led the CSE, the environmental organization, to say all these plans are just yap, yap, yap. Because actually nothing is, and gap, 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 and yap, 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 and nothing has been done. And in fact, the other day, actually only a couple of weeks ago, the Auditor General actually did an audit of the latest Ganga action plan, the plan to save the Ganga under this current government. And their conclusions were pretty depressing, actually. I was just looking them up today, and they basically said there were deficiencies in financial management, in planning, implementation, and monitoring. Of the 1.5 billion that was supposed to have been spent in a couple of years, only $260 million, so that's dollars, had been spent. So a lot of money has been allocated, not very much has been spent, and the money that has been spent has not produced the results that everybody hoped for.
Certainly. So basically they're saying everything. I do want to get to the solutions to this, because they're discussed in such detail in the book. But just first to give a sense of both the physical and the historical part of the Ganga that you seem to have touched. You know, every time you touch a bank of the Ganga and you know that there is a mythological character attached to it, you write about that, which makes it very interesting. And I think for those of us who have traveled the breadth and the length of the Ganga, what amazes one is how it is a person. I mean, obviously we think of her as a goddess, we think of her as a female figure, but you know, there up in the mountains, the Ganga is sharp and thin and very fast, and at different times she is large and generous and bountiful, and at other times she's a bit old and sluggish and not very pretty to look at. What's your favorite part?
That's quite right. And in fact, Nehru, in his will, when he said even though he wasn't a religious person, he wanted his ashes to be scattered in the Ganga, he said something very similar about the different moods of the Ganga, you know, sometimes dangerous and sometimes clear and sometimes slow and sluggish and so on. I think it's very hard to say. I like all bits of the river. Obviously, when you're upstream in the mountains, in the foothills of the Himalayas, it's a wonderful place to be. You know, when you go to the glacier, the very source of the Ganga, it's an extremely sort of moving experience. You have this incredibly clear skies, you have cold air, you have this rushing torrent, and it is at that point, of course, totally clean. But then it's equally impressive when you get down to the Sundarbans at the mouth of the Ganga in the Bay of Bengal, when you have this incredibly beautiful sort of network of mangrove swamps with tigers, you know, the Royal Bengal tiger, with all these beautiful birds. So, you know, there are many different aspects of the river. And then, of course, you've got Varanasi in the middle. I mean, there are many cities and sites and many forms of wildlife and natural beauty that you can celebrate on the Ganga, as well as, you know, the pollution that afflicts parts of the river. So it's very much, I mean, I think it's important to say that it's very much a living river. Some of the tributaries have been killed by pollution, and that's our responsibility as inhabitants of India. But the main river itself it is polluted, but it is a living river. You can see fresh, and you know, surprisingly few Indians know this, you can see freshwater dolphins all the way up at Allahabad, you know, hundreds, thousands of kilometers from the sea. And in some of the tributaries as well, in the Chambal and so on. So you have this extraordinary wealth right in the heart of the most densely populated part of the planet, and it's just a great thing to celebrate, and a great thing to not so much preserve, but to save from death by toxic waste.
And certainly, you just mentioned the Chambal, and so many of us, even in India, would not necessarily know that actually here is one of the greatest contradictions. The most revered river ends up becoming the most polluted. And the river that's known as accursed is actually one of the most delightful rivers to be on, the Chambal. Tell us a bit about that.
I mean, I sort of came across the Chambal because I was looking at a BBC documentary about the Ganga, and seeing all these beautiful, you know, gharials, the crocodiles, the long-snouted crocodiles, freshwater dolphins, beautiful birds, and I was thinking, I've been all along the Ganga and I don't know where this is. It can't be the Ganga. So I asked somebody who was involved in this program, and they said, oh, well, that's not the Ganga itself. That's the Chambal, which is, as you say, this river that runs through north-central India and joins the Yamuna, and then joins the Ganga at Allahabad. And yeah, so it is ironic, actually, that, and this was explained to me by one of the people who guided me to see some of the rare gharials on the Chambal, that because it's cursed, very few people traditionally have lived along it, except a few farmers, and it's been left alone. There are no temples until it meets the Yamuna. And the result of that is that while the Yamuna, after Delhi, the Yamuna becomes essentially a sewer, goes to Mathura, goes past Agra, and it's basically full of toxic waste and raw sewage, until it's joined by the Chambal with this beautiful clean water which cleans the Yamuna, which in turn enters the Ganga, and means that the Yamuna is not entering the Ganga as basically as a sewer, which it more or less would be if it were not for the Chambal. So it is an irony. But the other thing is, it's so close to Delhi, and very, very few people in Delhi know that there is this beautiful, and there's actually I think a national park or a reserve that is on both banks of the river for 400 kilometers along the Chambal. And you know, if you live in Delhi, and you're going to Agra, I would strongly advise a trip to the Chambal, because it's this sort of natural wonderland that very few people know about, very few people read about it. You never read about the Chambal in the newspapers. You always read about the Yamuna and the Ganga, but you never hear about the Chambal, and maybe it's because it has no sort of religious connotations.
But yeah, and it has this kind of superstitious connotation almost. Now, so much of what you've said already gives the sense that what you have dealt with is not just the Ganga as the river, but the Ganga as a Hindu entity in particular. And of course, the first river to have been called a living entity by the state.
I think it was the courts, wasn't it? Although I can't remember if it was then. Was it
then
reversed?
The government adopted.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Good.
You know, today is Dr. Martin Luther King Day, and one of the things he said about India is that to other countries you go as a tourist. To India, I visit as a pilgrim. Much of this is, much of Victor's book does tie into the religious aspect of the Ganga and how it's seen, and some of the most vivid parts of it, I think, come from the Kumbh Mela, which is when a lot of us engage with the Ganga, perhaps in a very different format from any other. You speak about the Kumbh, the miracle of the Kumbh, the fact that 10 million people a day go in to bathe in the Ganga. An entire city is created along with its own mechanisms, along with its own sewage system, which is actually sadly more perfect than the cities the Ganga lives through on a daily basis. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the parts of the book where I tried to become optimistic, and I say, actually, cleaning a river is not an impossible task, in the same way that building a city with facilities is not an impossible task. It is difficult, it takes money, and so on. And what struck me about the Kumbh Mela was precisely that in 2 months they build on the sandbanks at the confluence of the river, they build a city for 2 million people. The people rotate in and out, and it has electricity, it has roads, it has telecommunications, it has sanitation, it has a police force, it has law and order, it has health centers, it has all these things that regular cities, including Allahabad, mostly lack. So when you say to people, and I interviewed them, and there was a group from Harvard that did a study of this, and you say to them, how can it be that you can do this, and the city is then dismantled, this beautiful functioning city that actually doesn't cost very much per day is then dismantled. I say, how can you do this? And people sort of say, well, one of the best explanations I thought was, it's Indian wedding syndrome, which means that when you really need to, the whole family pulls together and they spend a lot of money and they put in an enormous effort to make this one event a huge success. So that means that it can't be done all the time. But in fact, it can be done all the time. Ganga Sagar is another example. West Bengal. The West Bengal government is in many ways as ineffective as the government of Uttar Pradesh. And yet every year you have Ganga Sagar, more than 1 million people come. Again, they have toilets. There are very strict rules about not throwing your rubbish in the water, and they enforce them. Rules are enforced, and people who've never had toilets at home have to use them. So you have this extraordinary situation. And I remember going at Ganga Sagar, and there were these ball minstrels. These are traditional Bengali minstrels singing this absolutely haunting melody. And I was with a colleague who speaks Bengali, and I said, this is beautiful. And the crowds were gathered around listening to these musicians. And I said, what are they singing about? And she said, well, they're singing, you must use the toilets and wash your hands afterwards. And it turned out they were actually a government propaganda message, and they had been paid by the government and by the organizers of Ganga Sagar to put this message across. But that's okay. I mean, it was a great event.
One part of the trouble, and we do need to discuss the two very important chapters, which are on toxic waste and the creation of a superbug that the Ganga seems to have become a kind of petri dish for. One of the real issues is of course the raw sewage that goes into the Ganga. The other is stopping the effluents. According to you, and let's discuss a few solutions now before I take questions from the audience, what is really going to be the answer? Is it to legislate? Is it to regulate? I know that in your book you speak about how London talked about legislation on the Thames in a 1535 Act. Now, clearly, we don't want to wait 3.5 centuries to be able to do this. But is legislation eventually the first step?
I think the first step, yes, is to have plans and have laws and so on. But as we all know, there are many laws in India and few of them are enforced. So the issue is really about implementation, and that is where all these plans have fallen down. But the great thing about cleaning rivers is people have this idea that you must spend a lot of money scrubbing the river clean of its dirt. It's not like that. All you have to do when you clean a river is to stop polluting it. And of course that's not necessarily easy, but it's doable. You build sewage treatment plants, you make sure that factories don't put effluent in the water, you make sure that farmers don't let their pesticides go in the water and so on. So you don't actually have to clean it, you just have to stop dirtying it. And that is doable. And one of the things that I think is very important is to understand that this is not, the Ganga is not the only river in the world that has ever been polluted. Industrial revolutions, modernization around the world, starting in the UK, but continental Europe, the United States, East Asia, Southeast Asia, China, and so on, they've all had huge problems with river pollution. I mean, when I was a kid growing up in London, my mum said to me, don't fall in the river because it's so toxic, the Thames, that you'll have to have your stomach pumped. Now the Thames is now a clean river. My newspaper's office is on the banks of the Thames, and we have cormorants fishing under Southwark Bridge in the center of London. And so rivers can be transformed. And Modi, when he actually went to see Obama for the first time in September 2014, one of the things they talked about was environmental issues. And Obama comes from Chicago, and he said the Chicago River used to be really disgusting, and it used to catch fire. The rivers of that part of the United States were so dirty they used to catch fire. But they're now clean, and they're so clean that you can catch fish and you can eat the fish. And Modi said to Obama, that's what I want for the Ganga. So there is actually a possibility of emulating what was done with the Thames in London, what was done with the Rhine in Europe, what was done with the Chicago River, and what is being done with rivers in Southeast Asia, places like Thailand and Malaysia and so on. So they are actually working on cleaning up their rivers. But the thing about the Ganga is it's more important than any of these rivers. And the Ganga is a much more important river to India than the Thames is to England. So it is important that we do these things. And the issue is not legislation, the issue is implementing plans, often at the municipal level, just to do sensible things like stopping pollution.
Basically, when you speak about this promise of 2014, because as you say, every few years we hear from the government deciding that now this is going to be their big priority. The truth is, India has so many big priorities that even though all of us understand that cleaning the Ganga is intrinsic to our very way of life, it doesn't actually get the priority it deserves. Even today, I think it's is it a 20,000 crore plan? Anyway, the equivalent of about
$3 billion, roughly.
The Rhine took 20 years to clean. It cost over $50 billion, I think. So when this promise had come from the new government as well, and Mr. Modi was going in particular, as you said, he met Mr. Obama, he went to the UK, spoke about the Thames, he went to Germany and spoke about how the Rhine was clean, and then he was in Japan, which has put a lot of money into particularly Varanasi and the Varanasi-Kyoto sort of sister city project. And I remember as a journalist, I was speaking to various officials who were dealing with this. And of course the Germans, who are very particular about every word and the technicalities, were explaining to me how the comparison between the Rhine project and the Ganga project would mean that India would have to show a lot of patience and start now, but see the results in 30 years.
I think you're right, and there is this issue of priorities. Why should we spend money on cleaning a river for environmental or spiritual purposes when we could be building hospitals or schools? And I think the way to think of it is this, which is that cleaning the Ganga is not a project that is isolated in itself. There are kind of multiple benefits from doing these things. And sanitation, for example, if you improve sanitation in North India, that would clean the Ganga, but you're doing it not just to clean the Ganga, you're doing it to save the lives of hundreds and hundreds of children. Indian children are dying every day across the country from totally preventable diseases, from diarrhea, stomach problems. And this is, so if you improve sanitation by building treatment plants, by having toilets, by connecting them, by making sure the plants are operating, these are the basic functions of government, whether they're state government or municipal government or central government. If you do that, yes, you clean the Ganga, but you also, which is good for environmental reasons, it's good for spiritual reasons, but you also save the lives of all these children. And you create hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs in doing these projects that India very badly needs for its workforce. So, what I argue is that this is not a sort of isolated Western environmental project, a goody-goody thing. It's actually something that is fundamental to India's development, regardless of whether or not the river is clean. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. In fact, one of the diplomats I spoke to said to me, "Ma'am, can you explain?" At that time, they were getting ready the next year. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came to Varanasi, and he and Prime Minister Modi stood on the banks of the Ganga. And there was some concern about whether they would actually drink the water, and what was the water actually going to be. I have a feeling it had more to do with bottled water than anything else. But what the official said to me is, "Ma'am, can you explain to your government that in order to clean the Ganga at Varanasi, the Ganga before Varanasi is going to have to be cleaned as well. And downstream, that's really how it works." Victor uses a very, very strong statement when he says that people are killing the Ganga, and the Ganga is now killing them. So before I head to questions, tell us a little bit about the idea of the superbug, which many in India still think is a bit of a conspiracy theory, and especially the idea that this gene was named after New Delhi, I think was particularly hurtful. But how dangerous can it be?
Well, I mean, I'll be brief because it's quite a complicated subject, but it is a very important one. Many people worldwide are now dying of bacterial infections that are essentially untreatable. And India is a very fertile place for these superbugs to develop. And essentially, we're not talking about a human gene, we're talking about a bacterial gene. And I just stumbled across this when I was researching, if you like, regular pollution. And then I came across these scientific papers talking about, for example, when pilgrims go from population centers like Delhi to Haridwar in the upper reaches of the Ganga, they not only spread, fecal bacteria, which is just, they also are spreading superbugs. And they're spreading bacteria which have a gene in it, and one of the versions is known as NDM 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, which is for New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase, but you don't need to know that. But the point is that these bacteria are in Delhi, they're in the big cities of India, and when people go to the pristine upper stretches of the Ganga for pilgrimages, they spread not only disease, because sanitation at a lot of these pilgrimage sites is not very good, they also spread superbugs. And unfortunately, India is a very good place for the evolution of superbugs. And again, the recorded number of children dying in hospitals of totally untreatable bacterial infections is something like, at the last count, which was 2011, is something like 50,000 children a year. And that's just the ones we know about, and that's just the ones in hospitals. So, and worldwide, there's a fear that 10 million people a year will be dying of totally untreatable infections, which is more than cancer, I think, at the moment. So this is a potentially very large problem. And in a nutshell, the issue with India is that there's a lot of disease, there's a lot of poverty, and there's a lot of poor sanitation, and there's quite a large pharmaceutical industry. And the combination of all those stresses and facility of spreading disease around means that it's a very good place for superbugs to evolve, and they do evolve here. They also evolve in China, they also have started evolving in other parts of the world, but it is quite a serious problem that I think the Indian media hasn't really addressed that much, although you do see occasional articles about it. And I sort of picked it up originally, I think, from a press report, but then I started digging and was quite alarmed by what I found. But I just want to say one thing, which is that the great thing about any project to save the Ganga is that it's not controversial, in the sense that this is not something that Muslims will object to. Akbar cherished the waters of the Ganga, the Emperor Akbar, because of its purity.
Jahangir, I think, actually settled a lot of his artisans.
Yeah, I mean,
all
the Mughal emperors, they actually got water transported for hundreds of kilometers from the Ganga because they liked the water so much. They felt it had sort of life-giving, purifying, almost religious properties. So there's no controversy. You know, again, Modi himself, people have forgotten this, but when he was campaigning in Varanasi, he talked about Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, you know, this kind of mixed Muslim Hindu heritage of North India. So this is not a project which anyone is going to say, this is outrageous, this is offensive to me as a member of a particular religion. This is something that everybody benefits from and everybody can contribute to.
Unfortunately, it's only the people on one side who have been benefiting from it, perhaps in all these years. I do want to take your questions now, but Victor, if I could ask you to just read a little bit of your journey on the Ganga before we go to the audience.
This is basically the book sort of proceeds from the source to the mouth of the Ganga in a very loosely, and this is from the second or the last chapter where the Ganga meets the ocean, and it's when the river gets to the Sundarbans, and I'm basically just describing what the river has gone through as it gets to this point, 2,500 kilometers from the ice cave in the Himalayas, and so to the sea and the river's end. By the time the Ganges reaches the Bay of Bengal, the first runnels of melted ice from its sources in the Himalayas have been joined by multiple mountain streams, by the clean waters of the Chambal and the filth of the Yamuna, by the Ram Ganga, the Son, the Punpun, the Kyul. From Nepal to the north have come the Sada, the Gomti, the Gagra, the Gandak and the Kosi, the latter a temperamental river whose habit of sudden destructive migrations across the landscape has earned it the name the Sorrow of Bihar. In Bangladesh, the river has been swollen by the Meghna and by the Brahmaputra sweeping down from Tibet and Assam. Because the Brahmaputra is longer and more voluminous than the Ganges, one could argue that it is the Ganges and not the Brahmaputra that is the tributary here. In the alluvial mud of the delta spanning the India-Bangladesh border, the river breaks apart, the turbid waters seeking their path to the ocean down a filigree of ever-shifting distributaries and tidal channels. The pure water melted from the glacier at Gomukh has by this point been subjected to all the follies and wonders of India. It has helped generate electricity at the Terry Dam and been diverted by barrages and canals to the rice paddies and vegetable fields of Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, or the taps of Delhi and the tanneries of Kanpur. At dam after dam and pump after diesel pump, billions of litres are extracted from the river for farms and factories. What remains after evaporation and consumption has seeped back into the river as groundwater from the fields or as sewage from the cities, tainted now by fecal bacteria, industrial chemicals and pesticide residues. At Gomukh in the highlands and at Saga Island in the Bay of Bengal, at Gangotri, Haridwar, Allahabad, Bateshwar, Varanasi, Patna, Calcutta and everywhere in between, the water has also been worshipped as the goddess Ganga or the goddess Yamuna, or both, garlanded with flowers, blessed with coconuts, and decorated with floating candles. Pilgrims in their thousands, sometimes in their millions, have plunged themselves and their idols into the stream, raised the water in cupped hands towards the rising sun, and let it fall on their ecstatic faces. Grieving sons have scattered the ashes of their cremated parents in the river, while the less fortunate, unable to purchase enough firewood, have discreetly rolled the half-burnt corpses of their loved ones into the forgiving waters. The main stream of the Ganges still teems with life along most of its length. It was from the villages and towns on the banks of the Ganges and its tributaries that millions of Indians, Bengalis and Nepalese migrated to the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Middle East and Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. It was in boats and ships down its lower reaches that many sailed to fight for the British in the First and Second World Wars. Before spending its waters in the sea, the Ganges has served a tenth of humanity in an area of more than 1 million square kilometers, passing on its way the monuments of the great civilizations and empires, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim and Christian, that have thrived on its bounty for thousands of years.
May I see with just hands where all the questions are, and we'll try and get to them because we have about 10 to 15 minutes, 10 minutes I think. Please go ahead. We'll take maybe 3 or 4 questions.
Would you care to comment on the Ganga as a political symbol now? Because when PM Modi was elected, the first public act he did was to go to Varanasi and offer an arti to the Ganga. Would you care to comment on that, please, as a political Hindu symbol?
Yeah, I think it is a Hindu symbol, but it is also, I think, a symbol of India. As I said, he did, just before that, he did talk about, the mixed, and he was praising, Muslim poets and Muslim singers. So, and you remember, he needed the votes of the Muslims in Benares as well as the votes of the Hindus. I think, the political mood has obviously moved on, but I don't think it's controversial for a Hindu to worship at the Ganga. I don't think that's any more controversial than anything else. I think what's important is that as I said earlier, that this is a river for all Indians. All Hindus around the world, but all Indians who live and depend on it and its waters. So I don't feel that, I spoke to many Muslims in the course of writing this book, and in fact, to give you an idea, in Moradabad on the Ram Ganga, which is a very polluted tributary of the Ganga, I met a guy who was a Ram Ganga Mitra, he was a Muslim dentist from Moradabad, and he was one of the people campaigning to clean the river. Not because he was religious as a Muslim or because he loved Hindus. He did it simply because he said, what he said? He said, I used to bathe in the river as a child. Oh, no, he said, my father used to bathe in the river as a child. I can't, and maybe my children can't. But what I hope is that if we clean this river, my grandchildren will be able to swim in the river. And I thought that was very moving. And this was not a religious issue. It's an issue of saving a river on which we all depend.
The gentleman.
Hello, Helmut, directing the German Institute here, so coming from the Rhine country. We work on water a lot and rivers here from the Chennai perspective. 2 remarks. The scope is even much bigger. India is in its worst water crisis ever, so cleaning rivers is that, and it's also to tackle climate change. It has a global aspect. The 2 remarks. One is about the notion of purity. It's a question that I never understood, and I think we have to change the narrative somehow. We have to change it in the sense that not so much government discourse, but how to bring the people to the river. So how is it possible that I can purify my soul and my body in the most polluted river? I don't get an answer to that, and maybe we come to that. Yeah. The last thing, very short, I think the other narrative to change is clean up. We clean up our house every day. It's dirty the next day. Cleaning up is not the question here. It is renaturating, it is restoring, it has to be sustainable, and as you mentioned, it's a process of 20 or 30 years, not of election campaigns and periods.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One of the questions I tried to answer is, why is it that a river that people worship, they also are making dirty? And that, I saw somebody from a Ganga temple on the Ram Ganga throwing a bag of plastic bag full of rubbish into the river from the temple. So a very large number of the people that I met, the argument is this, right? And they say, well, there's a distinction between the spiritual purity of the river and the purifying power of the Ganga and the physical state of the river. And a typical person that you meet will say, whatever I do to the river doesn't matter, because that's physical. The spiritual purity of the river is intact. So I can throw as much garbage and toxic waste in the river, doesn't matter. She is a powerful goddess. Now, a lot of environmentalists and indeed holy men that I've met at sort of ashrams along the river would say and argue and try to convince other people that this is nonsense. And there's a very good reason why it's nonsense, because the spiritual power of the river, and we used to worship rivers in Europe in ancient times, in 2,000 years ago in Britain, we worshipped river confluences as they are worshipped in India today. So what you have to tell people is that the reason why the river has this spiritual power is precisely because of its physical qualities. So, rivers, we worship rivers in ancient times, and in India we worship them today precisely because they bring life. They bring fertility and they bring life. And once you stop that life-giving, once you kill that life-giving quality, you are actually killing the goddess. You are killing the spiritual power of the river. And once you persuade people of that, I think they understand. But it is a very deeply entrenched separation in people's minds, especially among some devout Hindus, that you cannot do anything to the river physically that will damage it because she is so spiritually pure. And that is the view that has to be changed.
Also the idea that it's somebody else's problem. So there's this lovely character who's a Naga sadhu in the book who Victor speaks to, and Victor says, how concerned are you about how bad the river is? And he says, I'm very, very concerned. The government must do something about it. So even, you know, the very spiritual people are saying, well, cleaning it up is somebody else's problem.
Yeah. Sorry, just very briefly, the other things you mentioned, there are chapters in the book. So there is a chapter that talks about climate change. There is a chapter that talks about water shortages. And I know here in Tamil Nadu there's a huge issue with the Kaveri River. Similar problems are happening in North India as well. So, you know, these are all issues that I talk about. Sorry, yeah, gentleman at the back.
Yes, sir. You were talking about modernization and westernization. I agree with that. There is what do you call certain amount of a negative thing or some kind of a superstitions go with. How do you overcome these? The thing would be that I would say Sanjay Gandhi introduced Maruti car, you know, first time in collaboration with Japanese, Indira Gandhi's son. But unfortunately, he met with a plane accident. He died. So, do you think there is something like superstitions and things like that we can overcome and go ahead with the modernization without compromising the spiritual aspects of it?
Thanks. If I could just take one more question at the back. I'm taking only questions in the front, and we don't have more than 5 minutes. There's a lady over there. Maybe you could go right to her. She's there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. And because we have people from both Rhine and Thames experience, I'm just a bit pessimistic. Did Europe have to get rich before they considered cleaning up their rivers? So will we have to wait for India to get rich?
A quick observation that I have is that Victor, in his short conversation with you, mentioned India or Narendra Modi or things of those nature 16 times, and I counted, and Uttar Pradesh or West Bengal only once each. Isn't the seat of political authority at the state level, and aren't we shifting the problem to Delhi, which is probably a fundamental problem with India, rather than giving the power to the states? For example, we are right behind the river Kumbh, and the problem, like Delhi has nothing to do with it. It's the Madras Corporation.
I'm going to start with that last one first, because I think it's very, very important. You're absolutely right, and I do actually talk about, you know, why things don't work, and one of the reasons I say is exactly what you're saying, which is that you know, there is this problem of the central government. Basically, we talk about the central government, of course, because the central government is the power in the land. State governments are important, but even state governments are really useless in this regard. And actually what India needs, and this is a sort of, you know, potentially a sort of technically a governance issue, but all these things that need to be done, if you want to ensure that a factory is not polluting the river, if you want to ensure that sewage is not polluting the river, you need power at the municipal level. And India doesn't really have a system, with the exception of, I think, Delhi and Mumbai and a couple of other cities. You don't really have any city authority with enough financing and enough power to actually get things done. And all of those issues are local issues. And you're absolutely right, is that we do talk too much about the central government, which has limited power. But what the central government should do, of course, is to set the framework, and then the implementation has to happen at the local level. Even the state government, I mean, Uttar Pradesh, 200 million people, it's the size of Brazil. It's very corrupt, it's very inefficient. You know, the State Pollution Control Board in most of the states is very, very inadequate and very inefficient and very corrupt. And you know, and I say that from experience. You know, I've spoken to the people. The data they produce is horrible. You know, but even the Central Pollution Control Board isn't much good either. So you really need to have. I mean, I think Indian citizens need to sort of, you know, persuade their local officials. You know, the problem is there aren't enough mayors who have power. But it's a very tricky issue, and somehow there has to be a way of persuading state governments, yes, particularly state governments, because they are now the ones with the power, but also to get sort of city governments and people at the city level to do the right thing. The other questions were, I've forgotten what your question was, sorry.
do we have to get rich before we are able to be environmentally?
That's a, you know, it's a very good point, and I do actually raise it in the book, and I say one of the things I found actually was that in talking about and writing about the Ganga is that actually very few Indians have criticized me for sort of being an interfering Westerner trying to clean up their holy river. And I think that's because Indians themselves, and obviously everyone I speak to in the book, almost without exception, is Indian. I think Indians themselves recognize that it's a really important issue, that you know, you don't need to get rich and destroy your rivers. You actually, as I said earlier, you need to do things anyway. So you need sanitation regardless of whether you're cleaning the river. India needs that to you know, to improve the health of its people and save the lives of its children. So I don't think you do need to get rich. Of course, these things need money, but as the CAG report shows, one of the problems is that lots of money is allocated and either not spent or spent unwisely and improperly. So you know, I was amazed to discover when I got to Delhi that the World Bank has had a program waiting with $1 billion waiting to go into saving the Ganga. And when I got there, it had been 3 years, I think, and not a penny had been spent except on the occasional flight for a World Bank consultant. And this is, you know, the World Bank, even now they're having problems with, the World Bank has tried to help India to introduce real-time water pollution monitoring stations. And I see from the CAG report that of the 113 that were supposed to have been set up, only a third or so have actually been put in. So, yeah, it's, I don't think you need to get rich before you start saving your environment. And I think, you know, the Chinese government, Asian governments have come to this realization that this is not about imposing a sort of Western green economy on anybody. This is about basically about basic health and basic, you know, environmental success. And it's very important for India because it's so heavily populated. You know, you can't afford to let the Ganga die or the Kaveri River or any other river die because so many people depend on it.
Perfect. There was one last question. I think the gentleman's been waiting, and we can end.
Oh, by the way, before you go on, I should say the book is actually called. The title is called "A River Runs Through It" of this talk, but the book's actually called "River of Life, River of Death." Just in case you're asking for it in the shop.
The river Ganga wasn't polluted 400 or 500 years before. Only recently, after the Industrial Revolution, that the river is getting polluted. Earlier, for example, for tea, they used to use their own cups or glasses or earthenware pots. Now, it's being served in plastic cups, which is dumped into the river. Your comments on that?
You're right. I mean, I wouldn't say that the Ganga wasn't polluted before. It was polluted to a much lesser extent, and in a way that wasn't particularly threatening. But, you know, there's always been the problem of human sewage in the Ganga. But the really important thing to realize, and there is a chapter on demographics in this book, in 1900, the population of present-day India was something like 238 million. Now and people complained then about pressure on the environment, pressure on resources. Now the population is getting on for 1.4 billion. So, you know, that is one of the reasons why, as well as the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, of course, added other factors, particularly industrial pollution. And there is also, I talk a lot about the tanneries of Kanpur because tanneries are particularly dangerous producers of pollution. And again, there are solutions there that can be implemented. But you're right, certain forms of pollution came with the Industrial Revolution. Other forms of pollution have simply got worse and got bigger because of the growth of the population.
All right. I'm told it is a wrap, sir. So maybe you can maybe approach us later. I have to wrap this session, but thanks so much for joining us. And sir, we'll take your comments after. And thank you so much for joining us. There is also a chapter on Bollywood and the Ganga, which we haven't spoken about, but I do hope you enjoy reading. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And we can sign books afterwards.